Delighted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. Our speaker today is a Lund Distinguished Practitioner in Residence. The Lund Practitioner in Residence program is an initiative of the Mario Einaudi International Studies Center, and it aims to facilitate constructive exchange and dialogue between students and scholars at Cornell on the one hand, and professionals who are working on international issues beyond academia. So today we have the honor and privilege of learning from Dmitri Alperovitch. Am I pronouncing your name right? Okay, thank you. Co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Dmitri began his career in computer science, where he achieved international recognition for his work on cyber threat intelligence and eventually co-founded the firm CrowdStrike. In February 2020, he left CrowdStrike to help establish the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a think tank focused on policy solutions in national security, trade and industrial security, and ecological and economic security. In addition to his private sector and think tank work, Alperovitch has a distinguished record of government service. He serves on the Homeland Security Advisory Council of the Department of Homeland Security. He's also a founding board member of the U.S. government's Cyber Safety Review Board. He has previously served as a special advisor to the Department of Defense, and he's the host of Silverado's Geopolitics Decanted podcast and the author of an upcoming book, which we're going to hear more about today. So please join me in welcoming Dmitri Alperovitch.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here at Cornell. I'm very grateful for the invitation. As was mentioned, I have an upcoming book. It's called World on the Brink. The pre-order links available on Amazon and your favorite bookstores. And today I'm going to talk to you about the thesis of the book, which is that we are a world on the brink, on a precipice of a potential catastrophic war with China. And I'm going to outline the reasons why we are in such a dangerous period, potentially on the brink of what could be a nuclear exchange between two superpowers, and what can be done to prevent it. As I mentioned, I do have a podcast that I host on a sort of bi-weekly basis. It covers a lot of national security topics. War in Ukraine has been one of the dominant themes of the last 18 months, and the military strategy, political strategy of that war. We also talk a lot about China, Taiwan issues, technology issues like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and the like. And the whole purpose of the podcast is to dive really, really deeply into those issues, because I believe that details matter, and you cannot have a superficial understanding of these really complex policy issues. You need to appreciate the nuances of each and every one of them. Coming here to Cornell, which is, by the way, my first time here, a very beautiful campus, but I can't help but not think about the previous speakers that have been here at Cornell and the huge geopolitical consequences of those speeches. So in 1995, you had the then president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-ho, speak here provide a commencement address as an alum of the school, which was one of the things that have precipitated the third Taiwan crisis, and was one of the few times when the United States and China were actually on the brink of war back in 1996. We may not recall it, but President Clinton at the time had sent 2 aircraft carrier groups into the Taiwan Strait. There was great concern that China would try to intervene in the upcoming elections, the first elections, democratic elections that Taiwan was holding at the time. And a lot of concern on the part of Beijing that it would trigger independence. And the Chinese fired missiles over the strait, and the Clinton administration truly believed that the risk of war was quite high. So hopefully this speech will not precipitate a crisis like that. The first thing I want to propose to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are, despite what the Biden administration says, in Cold War II. Not 2.0. This is not a continuation of the first Cold War. It is a fundamentally different conflict, and I'll talk about the similarities and differences. But we are in this conflict, and we don't have a choice sometimes about being in a conflict, be it cold or hot. It is not just up to us. Obviously, the other side has a say in this. You know, Ukraine does not want to be in a war with Russia, but it is. And I find the remarks from the administration and others in Washington, D.C. talking about the desire not to be in Cold War II interesting because, again, if the other side is pursuing and has been pursuing, as I believe, for decades, a Cold War style policies, we don't have a choice but to ignore that. First of all, why are we in Cold War already? Well, if you look at a common definition, this is from Oxford, a Cold War, not the Cold War, is defined as a state of political hostility between countries characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare. I would propose to you that if you look at the state of the US-China relationship, it fits this definition to a T. A lot of people that deny this concept that we're in Cold War II, excuse me, say that there are differences, fundamental differences between Cold War I and Cold War II, and there definitely are. I would argue, as we go through this, that the similarities are much more significant than the differences, but nevertheless, we have to acknowledge those differences. But I would propose to you that World War I and World War II were fundamentally different conflicts with different coalitions, different reasons behind those conflicts, yet they were both world wars. So Cold War I and Cold War II are indeed different, but they're both Cold Wars. Let's talk about similarities. They're fairly easy to describe. So first of all, you have a global competition for supremacy that's been going on for decades now between the United States and China, at least 2 decades, probably going back even further if you look at the specific details. Both countries are vying for both dominance economically, influence globally as well as regionally in the Indo-Pacific, and both countries are trying to bring different countries on board with their model of governance, a democratic global security order that the United States has promoted and led since 1945, and a more authoritarian, mercantilist global world order that is being promoted by China. There's no question that we're in an arms race. The Chinese have been spending massively on their military. There are various estimates about their true state of spending. It's very likely much, much higher than what is publicly reported, given the tight integration of their industry and their military, but certainly well over $100 billion a year. You have seen advancements in both conventional and, in recent years, nuclear capabilities on the part of China as they're building up their missile launchers, silos, as well as rapidly building up their nuclear weapons arsenals that has been estimated about 300 nukes as recently as 10 years ago. And the Pentagon now estimates is going to be well over 1,000 before the decade is out. Does that sound like a Cold War I style arms race? And then, of course, on every manner of conventional weapons, whether it's hypersonics, whether it's traditional missiles, whether it's naval capabilities like submarines and destroyers and aircraft carriers and air forces, both sides are trying to build up their capabilities in this area. You now have economic warfare that has broken out since 2016, first with the Trump administration tariffs that have been put in place on Chinese imports, retaliation from China. Now the Biden administration not only continuing those policies, but accelerating it with export controls and even sanctions on certain Chinese industries. But the economic warfare actually did not start with that because for decades now, since the early 2000s, the Chinese have pursued their own form of economic warfare that included 2 key components. One of them was massive amounts of intellectual property theft. I've had the privilege, having worked in the cybersecurity field, to have investigated many of these intrusions into every single Western industry, most major companies. I've coined a phrase going back over a decade that there were only 2 types of companies out there: those that know that they've been hacked and those that didn't yet know, but they've all been hacked, and most of them by China. And the Chinese have been pilfering their intellectual property, their states, their trade secrets, in order to benefit their domestic sector. That was a key pillar of their economic warfare strategy. The second key pillar has been their efforts to use illegal subsidies as well as price dumping in critical industries like solar, like now batteries, like electric vehicles, rare earths that they pioneered the strategy on back in the 1980s to corner the market, to drive everyone else out of existence, and to dominate that field and establish a monopoly that would make the West, and more broadly, and the United States more specifically, heavily reliant on them. Ideological struggle. So many people would say, well, China is a capitalist society for the most part. Why is there an ideological struggle? And they're not trying to spread communism. Well, actually, when you look at Cold War I, the ideological element of that struggle is, I believe, way overhyped. There was certainly an attempt post-World War II, and certainly even before that, by Stalin and later on Khrushchev to some extent, to spread communism by conquering Eastern Europe, by trying to spread it in Asia and Latin America, but that largely ended in the late 1960s and 1970s. So in the second part of the Cold War, the Soviet Union really wasn't focused as much on spreading communism. It was much more focused on keeping allies, regardless of whether they were communist or not, in their sphere of influence in order to compete with the United States. What we've seen today is a very similar dynamic where it's not so much that China is trying to spread communism, it's not, but it is trying to spread authoritarianism, and it is trying to bribe and coerce and otherwise influence allies all over the world, in Africa, in Latin America, in certainly its own region, and in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, to bring people to their side and to try to separate them from the United States as much as possible. You've seen concerns in the media about the Solomon Islands, where the Chinese are bringing in influence into their police forces. You're seeing this in Africa, where they've opened up a school to teach their style of governance to potential leaders, future leaders on the African continent. And just like Cold War I, we have a major regional flashpoint that can bring both superpowers to the brink of conflict. In World War I, that role was played by West Berlin. So we may not remember now, but in the early days of the Cold War, the danger of the United States and the Soviet Union going to a war that could involve an exchange of nuclear weapons was incredibly high. It began with Stalin's attempts to squeeze America out of West Berlin following World War II, when we remained in that enclave that was surrounded by East Germany, with Soviet troops being based there. And you may recall in the late 1940s, we had the Berlin airlift that was designed to break the blockade, the literal blockade that the Soviets instituted against West Berlin, and to have that enclave survive. Ultimately, that was successful, but the threat did not end there. And throughout the 1950s, even post-Stalin with Khrushchev, there were ongoing attempts to pressure America to leave West Berlin along with its allies and to have East Germany occupy the critical enclave. In fact, we now know, based on research done by my very good friend, Sergei Radchenko, a Cold War historian at Johns Hopkins, who has gotten access to really very recently declassified documents from the Soviet Party archives from that period, talking about how Khrushchev in Politburo meetings was talking about the fact that America would never go to war, particularly nuclear war, over West Berlin, and that the mere threat of that to Eisenhower and later Kennedy would force America to back down. And when that didn't happen in 1961, he was incredulous. He could not believe, having himself gone through the horrors of World War II and seen death and destruction, that the United States, in his opinion, would be so crazy as to fight for what he thought was this meaningless piece of land surrounded by Soviet forces, West Berlin, and would risk the destruction of America, Soviet Union, the world, over this little piece of land. Nevertheless, successive U.S. administrations, successive U.S. presidents have made that stand for both geopolitical, strategic, and indeed human rights and moral reasons. In fact, I cite in my book an interesting episode where in August of 1961, when the danger of war was incredibly high, when the United States was waiting for the Soviets to launch an invasion of West Berlin and was prepared to retaliate, President Kennedy is woken up and is being told that the East Germans on behalf of the Soviet Union, started building what would later become the Berlin Wall. And President Kennedy, unlike his successive presidents, quietly celebrates that. He sighs in relief because, he says, if Khrushchev is building the wall, he's not invading. And the risk of war between the United States and the Soviet Union has just diminished dramatically. Now, next year, as you well know, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was actually, Sergei covers it really well in his upcoming book on this topic, was an outgrowth of the West Berlin crisis. But once we got past 1962, Cold War continued, and you had Vietnam, you had Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union, you had all kinds of tensions all over the world, various African interventions by the Soviet Union, and interference by the United States as well. But the threat of the two superpowers going to war diminished dramatically. And we entered another phase of the Cold War that was much less cold in terms of the prospect of a world war. I would argue that Taiwan today plays that part. It is the one piece of land that can cause the United States and China to go to war that could end up in a nuclear confrontation. We have lots of issues with China in the economic sphere and the geopolitical struggle, in the economic warfare, as I mentioned. But we will not go to war with China over Senkaku Islands, a piece of rock, a set of rocks in the East China Sea. We will not go to war with China over the Senkaku Islands, over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, or the artificial reefs that they've been creating. But Taiwan is different, and we'll talk about why that may be. The Cold War, the first Cold War, is commonly thought as have started in 1946 with the famous Iron Curtain speech in Missouri by Winston Churchill, when he identified the curtain falling on Eastern Europe and the emerging conflict between the two superpowers. Some say it may have begun earlier at the end of World War II, when it became very clear that the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was an opportunistic alliance between these two antagonistic systems, was not going to last once Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan fell. But I actually believe that the Cold War I began much, much earlier. I believe it began in 1920, long before America realized that it was in a Cold War. I believe it began at the end of the hot war between America and the Soviet Union. Many people do not recall today, but America actually did fight in Russia and lost troops, about 400 Americans that have perished there from 1918 through 1920, right after the end of First World War. America sided, along with allies, with the whites that were being fought by the Bolsheviks post-1917 revolution. It sent troops into Siberia. It sent troops in the Far East. It lost 400 lives. And there's even a memorial in Michigan commemorating that long-forgotten intervention. And eventually, of course, the Bolsheviks won the Civil War. The foreign troops withdrew. America moved on, but the Soviets didn't. If you read documentation from the Soviet Party, from the Soviet military, from the Soviet intelligence services, the lesson that they drew from that intervention by America, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, Japan, and others was that the West, the capitalist West, from their perspective, was determined to snuff out the communist revolution, and that they presented an existential threat to the Soviet Union. And that as long as the capitalist systems remained, that threat would persist, in their view. So what unfolded was an immediate focus on how do we fight the West. A great deal of focus was initially on Great Britain, which was the dominant power until World War II, but there was a focus on the United States as well. The newly formed CHK, which later became the well-known KGB, the civilian intelligence agency of the Soviet Union, had departments that were established in 1920 that were dedicated to espionage against Great Britain against Germany, against the United States. And part of that espionage was also economic espionage. Does that sound familiar? But the West didn't pay attention to that. The West moved on. And even before the United States recognized the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, it let American industrialists go to the Soviet Union and set up factories. Arm & Hammer, the founder of Occidental Petroleum, set up a factory, several factories in then Soviet Union. Ford came over and set up factories for manufacturing tractors in the Soviet Union and automobiles. Eventually, if you recall, the Soviet leaders during that Cold War driving in the Volga limousines, the domestically produced limousines on the Red Square during their parades, those Volga limousines were built in factories that were set up by Ford. Whole Caterpillar, now Caterpillar, came over and started producing combines for wheat harvesting in the Soviet Union, which were very rapidly reverse engineered by Soviet engineers. They kicked out Caterpillar, whole Caterpillar, and started producing their own combines, which gave them independence in wheat production. Very, very similar things that started happening in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s with China. So while we were not paying attention from Western standpoint, the Soviets were, and they were preparing. Obviously, there was an interlude with World War II when both sides were facing an existential threat from Nazi Germany, but it did not last, and the Cold War resumed. So those are some of the similarities between the two Cold Wars. Let me talk about the divergence, because there are certainly some. The one that's cited most commonly is the economic interdependence between the West more broadly and the United States more specifically, and it's certainly enormous. However, it is a misconception to think that there were no economic ties between the Soviet Union and the United States and the West during Cold War I. As I mentioned, in the 20s and 30s, there was, in fact, a huge amount of ties, trade ties, and the like. But even once we woke up and realized that we were in Cold War I, ties continued. In fact, many of our allies, like like France and Italy, have continued to invest in the Soviet Union. The Lada automobiles that you may have seen in the Soviet Union were produced with a joint venture by Italian company Fiat in a city called Togliatti that they set up for the manufacturing of those automobiles. But even more than that, what is the one industry that was responsible for the economic welfare of the Soviet Union and was responsible for financing their military might? Anyone want to guess? No. What is the one industry that drives Russian economy today? Oil. It was the same thing in the Soviet Union days, particularly in the second part of the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. The entire Soviet Union oil industry was run off of Western technologies. Not even technologies they stole, technologies that were sold to them by Western companies that, in fact, financed their ability to prosecute the Cold War. Obviously, we were not consuming much from the Soviet Union, so it was a one-way dependency, unlike the mutual dependencies that exist today. But as you can see, the dependencies are not static. The United States today and Europe are pursuing a policy of decoupling. The tariffs are playing a role in that. The export controls are playing a huge role in that as well. So we will see where this economic interdependence ultimately ends up. The other thing that's commonly cited is that there's no rigid alliances, right? In the Cold War, we had NATO that was with us. And today, many of those countries, France being the most obvious one, are saying, we want no part of this. We don't want to choose. We want to keep a good relationship with China. We want to keep a good relationship with the United States. This also happened in Cold War I. People forget now, but France, once again, actually pulled out of NATO in the 1960s, out of NATO's military command structure. Famously, Charles de Gaulle, once France acquired nuclear weapons, announced a policy of all azimuth targeting. In other words, while the UK and the United States were focusing their missiles on targets within the Soviet Union in the event of war, France, at least publicly, said that they would target both sides, the United States, UK, and the Soviet Union, right? That's an ally. As I mentioned, many countries, like Italy in particular, had closer links to the Soviet Union than we would have liked. But even on their side, things were not very rigid. Famously, China, right, part of the communist bloc, ended up fighting a war with the Soviet Union in 1969, and later on with the Nixon reopening of China, ended up becoming closer to the United States than to the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia was playing that role as well, even though it was formerly part of the communist bloc, it was flirting with the West. And then you had a huge set of non-aligned countries, most prominently India, Indonesia, and many others, that said, we don't want to pick a side. So things were not as rigid as we might think back then, and they're not today. Many countries want to continue trading with China, but then you look at the Philippines, you look at India, you look at Japan, you look at Australia, you look at even some countries like Norway and Estonia and Lithuania. They're increasingly concerned with Chinese behavior, Chinese course of practices, and they're saying, wait a second, we are going to continue trading, but we're also going to invest in defense. We're going to invest in closer alliances like the Quad that India is a part of, like AUKUS that Australia and the UK are part of, to help confront China. Now, the other difference is that we're not seeing proxy fights, right? Thankfully, there's no Vietnam. There's no Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union. There's no Korean War yet. And hopefully we'll not see it. But during a lot of the periods of the Cold War, there were also no proxy fights, or very limited ones. So this is probably the one major difference that does exist and hopefully will continue to exist between the two Cold Wars. But I would argue, as I've just done, that despite those divergences, the similarities between the two Cold Wars are a lot greater than most people realize. All right, so we're on a Cold War. What next? In December 2021, 3 months before the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I went on Twitter, as one does, and I posted a threat that's been retweeted and liked thousands of times, where I said that I've come to a conclusion that before the winter was over, that President Putin was going to invade the nation of Ukraine. And I outlined a list of reasons for why he was going to do that. At the end of the day, it boiled down to just a few critical things for why I believe Putin decided that he had waited long enough and that he could not tolerate Ukraine continuing to get closer and closer to Western orbit, to flirt with joining the European Union, potentially down the road NATO. He could not flirt with the Western orientation of Ukrainian government and so forth. And he had decided to invade it, a crucial mistake, of course, and an illegal invasion. But I believe that very similar reasons might drive Xi Jinping, before this decade is over, to try to invade Taiwan. Let me go through some of them. The first one is history. So Putin erroneously believed, as he has written himself in 2021, in July of 2021, in a paper he published, that basically was historical revisionism, claiming that Ukraine had never existed, that it was always part of Russia. It was false. But in his mind, he believed that Ukraine never existed as a state until its independence in 1991, which he traced to the mistakes of Lenin, ironically, by saying that Lenin, when he created the Soviet Union, had given sort of these proxy independence to the different republics within the Soviet Union. It didn't matter because it was all part of one country. There was control from Moscow. But when the Soviet Union fell apart, it gave the impetus, in Putin's view, for all these republics to become individual countries, what he thought was historically unjust. Again, his view, not mine. China, and Xi Jinping more specifically, also erroneously believes that Taiwan belongs to China. In fact, most people don't appreciate this, but Taiwan actually never was fully occupied by China, ever, by Beijing. The Qing dynasty in the 1700s established outposts on Taiwan, but it was far end of their empire, and they never much cared for it. And in fact, during those periods of times, they never established full control of the island, and parts of the island were occupied by European colonialists. The Dutch, Spaniards, later even the Americans tried to land troops on Taiwan, but the Qing Empire never fully controlled it. And the only time that a Chinese leader had full control of Taiwan was actually in the 4 years from 1945 to 1949, when after the end of World War II, Taiwan was taken from Japan, which had occupied it since 1895, and was given to Chiang Kai-shek, who was nominally the leader of China at the time, the nationalist leader, but of course, he had no full control of the country because Mao's communists were on the run, were keeping him on the run, and he was already steadily losing territory. And eventually, he lost all of the territory, of course, on the mainland and fled to Taiwan. So that's how we now end up with Taiwan being where it is. But in fact, even in the 1930s, there are statements from Mao Zedong talking to people saying that Taiwan really doesn't belong to China, that he doesn't view it as a part of China. And that started to change only after the end of the Chinese Civil War, with the fleeing of Chiang Kai-shek's and his 2 million KMT Kuomintang forces to Taiwan. But now things are different. Now, the Chinese society and the Chinese leadership in particular is convinced that it is their destiny to own Taiwan. That not only do you have this historical affiliation in their view, although incorrect, that they believe that for China to be great, they have to unify all of the lands that contain Chinese people. Of course, they talk about that, and Hong Kong and Macau were key to that with the 1990s voluntary unifications, when both Britain and the Portuguese gave up control of those territories and transferred them to China for the commitment of the two countries, two systems, one country, two systems policy that Xi Jinping abandoned much earlier than the Chinese had committed to. But there's another reason why Taiwan matters, and that is geopolitics. It is a very strategic piece of real estate, as you will see later on, that is absolutely vital for Chinese ability to become a superpower, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but beyond. They also believe that it is vital for their security. So just as Putin had thought that Ukraine being part of Western orbit was a mortal danger to Russia because of the historical insecurities that Russians have, some of them justifiable, of European invasions of Russia, going through Ukraine, going through Belarus, and going all the way to Moscow, Napoleon, Hitler, obviously, Teutonic Knights before that. And even though we might say that NATO is a defensive alliance that has that poses no threat to Russia and certainly has no interest in invading Russia, we can't convince Moscow of that. That's what they believe. Xi Jinping believes that Taiwan being effectively, in their view, an outpost of the US empire right off Chinese coast presents a strategic threat to China. And more than a military threat, they believe it presents a political threat as well. Because while Taiwan exists and is not part of China, the Chinese believe that the Civil War is not over, right? Because they were not able to defeat Chiang Kai-shek, because he was able to flee with most of his forces to Taiwan and establish another system of government, also authoritarian, a brutal dictatorship that lasted until the late 1980s. They believe that they present an opposing view of China, of what China could be. And certainly once the Taiwanese reformed and essentially embraced democracy, that became an even more moral threat ideologically to the Chinese Communist Party. Geography plays a huge role in this as well. Just as you've seen just recently this summer, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, took his troops out of Ukraine, out of eastern Ukraine, and marched to Moscow in about 8 hours. He was within just a couple hours of Moscow, reaching Moscow. You got an appreciation for the distances that exist between Moscow and its border with Ukraine, and how Putin feels about the security of Russia if an adversarial force, which he considers NATO to be, is present on the borders, on Russian borders in Ukraine. The Chinese feel the same way, and I'll dive into that in a few minutes. And lastly, it's about ego. Putin believes that Ukraine should not exist as a country, that Crimea, certainly in his view, belonged to Russia, and he wanted to be the guy that made Russia great again, to borrow a phrase, by bringing first Crimea and then attempting to bring Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence, if not to conquer it outright. I believe President Xi feels the same way. If he can do what Mao could not do, despite attempts throughout the 1950s to launch invasions of Taiwan that kept getting postponed, first because of the Korean War, then for other reasons. If he can do that, he can go into the pantheon of Chinese history as someone who is greater than Mao. Today, he's already positioned himself in many ways on the same level. If he can accomplish this, he believes he can eclipse Mao. And President Xi just had a birthday in June. He turned 70. No Chinese leader ever survived as a leader into their 80s. So you might have you have a Communist Party election coming up in 27, and then another one in 32 every 5 years. So it's hard to see how Xi, who would be 79 in 32, would win another term. So you might have about 9 to 10 years for when he is thinking is the window for him to accomplish this goal, this dream, as he says, of the Chinese people to unify Taiwan and China. So why would an invasion be the only way that they could accomplish that goal? Right? There are other options. So first of all, Taiwan may decide to voluntarily join China. Well, I just returned from Taiwan a few weeks ago, and I can tell you from talking to both leadership of the country and regular people that almost no one in Taiwan has any interest of unifying with China. And not just because it is an authoritarian, brutal dictatorship controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, not just because they have seen what the Chinese do in Hong Kong in terms of suppression of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and arbitrary detainments and arrests, not just because of what they've seen the Chinese do in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs, but because, first and foremost, all of these things obviously are helpful as well. But more than that, they believe they have their own country. They really do. Regular people across both parties. So you have the two major parties in Taiwan, the KMT, which is the original Chiang Kai-shek party that now has ironically become, some people say, pro-China. Not quite accurate. They're more, I would say, pro-appeasement. Their view is the best way to avoid war is to be friendly with China. And then the DPP, which is basically a group of pro-democracy activists in the 1980s that established a party and then ultimately won elections that are now the ruling party in Taiwan. Neither of those parties is for unification with China. Again, they have a different view of how to manage the relationship. DPP thinks that the threat of invasion and war with China is greater than the KMT. They think that the best way to prepare for it is to build up their own national security, military capacity. The KMT thinks that's provocative, and they should at least talk to China more and so forth. But those are tactical disagreements. But no one in the KMT thinks that Beijing should rule Taiwan or that the two should be unified, because there's now, and really always been, a huge sense of Taiwanese culture, language. The Taiwanese language is an outgrowth of Mandarin, but it really is a separate dialect, and a sense that they have their own thing going. I believe that if China was a Jeffersonian democracy that was the beacon of freedom in the world, that the Taiwanese would have no interest in joining China, just as the Canadians have no interest in joining the United States, right? They've got their own thing going and they like it. And they're proud of their culture, they're proud of their history, and the same thing with the Taiwanese. So I believe that voluntarily the Taiwanese will never decide to unify with China. If you look at the polls, there are maybe 6% of the people, if that are for unification, and that's been going down steadily for years. That I think is now closed off permanently for China. There are people that say, well, gray zone tactics, propaganda, bribery of officials, which is certainly taking place in China. Other types of coercion would force the Taiwanese to do this. The Chinese have been engaged in that, of course, for decades, even going back to 1995 with the Cornell speech of the then president. Everything that they've done has actually pushed the Taiwanese further and further away, because coercion does not work in getting countries to submit to the will of others. It only gets them to stiffen their backbone and fight back. And there's no precedent in history when a country that would face these types of gray zone tactics would actually surrender and say, you know, we have a lot of propaganda coming from China, let's just unify. Not going to happen. The other scenario that a lot of people are concerned about is a blockade, right? There's a lot of talk in Washington, what happens if the Chinese blockade Taiwan? It's possible. I believe, for many reasons, that if China engages in the blockade of Taiwan, it will be absolutely disastrous for China. First of all, I don't believe they will accomplish their goal of getting Taiwanese to surrender. Again, in modern history, you do not have examples where blockades have actually gotten countries or even cities to surrender. Leningrad during World War II was blockaded in a very, very brutal way by the Nazis for several years. They did not surrender, even though they ran out of food and water and lost hundreds of thousands of people. There's a lot that's of talk of how Taiwan is relying on imports of food and energy, and that's true today. But having visited Taiwan, I can tell you that it's a very lush country. There's a lot of agricultural opportunities. If they had to be self-sufficient, in the case of a blockade, they can absolutely do that. They will not starve. And I do not believe that a blockade will cause them to surrender. What blockade will do, though, is destroy the world economy, including China's, because, of course, Taiwan is the epicenter of the semiconductor industry that is vital to the modern economy. And every single day that the blockade continues, the Chinese will face enormous pressure from every part of the world, including countries that are nominally friendly with them, to end that blockade every single day. And they will not be able to sustain them. To say nothing of the possibility that the United States military may actually run that blockade and force a confrontation between China and the US military. So I believe that if Xi Jinping indeed wants to take Taiwan, the only path for him to consider is invasion. Now, one might say, well, why should we care about Taiwan, right? If China wants to have it, it's right next to their borders, we're far away, maybe we should just let them have it. You know, some people are making that argument about Ukraine, right? Let's just have Putin take Ukraine. Why should we care? We've got Fortress America here. Well, there are many reasons to care. There are obvious ones in terms of defending freedom and democracy, human rights. We know, by the way, that what the Chinese plan to do. They're very open in case they take Taiwan. Various Chinese foreign ministry officials have said that we plan to set up re-education camps. For anyone that studied Cold War I history knows what that means. And in fact, not even Cold War I, you have to go to Xinjiang and check out what's happening to the Uyghurs to understand what that means. But the other, of course, self-interested case is economy. Taiwan produces somewhere around 90% of the most advanced chips in the world, around 40% of all chips. Chips are essential to everything around us. Every piece of electronics equipment requires chips. And just imagine the scenario, well, two scenarios. Imagine a scenario of conflict, a war, that will almost inevitably destroy the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. Just a minor power outages in those fabs that are highly dependent on keeping vacuum in the clean rooms, in these really most sophisticated technological factories in the planet, will cause irreparable damage to that industry that will have global repercussions almost instantaneously, almost certainly an immediate global depression. But more than that, imagine a scenario in which Taiwan just surrenders. Let's say that the Chinese declare an ultimatum that unless you surrender, tomorrow we're invading, and the United States says, not our problem. We'll let you have it. We're not getting involved. And the Taiwanese facing that, let's say they decide they're not going to fight, facing really overwhelming odds that they will lose. And China manages to conquer Taiwan without firing a shot and gets the industry intact, right? Let's say it's not destroyed in the process. Well, now you have given China vital control over what I believe is the most fundamental technology of the 21st century, semiconductors. Now, China has us over the barrel in terms of its ability to coerce us, the United States and the rest of the world, into doing their bidding. But more than that, there's a question of geography. So if you look at the map of China and Taiwan, again, you might say you have this little outpost of land next to the massive China. This is not even the full picture. I can fit it on the slide. Why should we care? And if you zoom out into the broader Pacific, we're far away. Guam is very, very far away, not to mention the Hawaii and the west coast of the United States. But all you have to do is rotate the map and put China in the center. And look at things from the Chinese perspective and look at it from the US perspective, right? So here you have Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and the rest of what's called the first island chain. And Taiwan is right in the center of it. And notice the depth of the oceans. Literally the entire coastline of China, from the South China Sea to the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, is very, very shallow. In fact, the depth of the waters in the Taiwan Strait is only 300 feet. You can't even put a submarine in there. And that has huge ramifications for the ability of the Chinese Navy to project power across the Western Pacific and beyond. Because as they're leaving ports of Hainan, Fujian, and others, their naval ships, their submarines, because it's so shallow, US assets in South Korea, in Japan, in the Philippines, potentially in Taiwan, can track them as they're traversing those gateways into the Pacific where the water depth drops dramatically, right? So on this western coast of Taiwan, here the depth is 300 feet. Here, right off the coast, is 1,200. And then it goes much deeper beyond that, right? The Pacific has some of the most deep waters in the world. And also, if you think about it, both from China's perspective and ours, Taiwan effectively keeps China bottled up. As long as they don't control Taiwan, and as long as the rest of the first island chain from Japan to the Philippines are effectively US allies, including with US military bases, as we now have back on the Philippines, as we've had in Japan since 1945, China is bottled up. From their perspective, and it's true, we're containing them. They're not able to break out. They're not able to project their full naval strength across the Pacific. And what stands in the way? Taiwan. If we want to keep China from dominating the Pacific, we can't let them have Taiwan. If Taiwan falls, our ability to defend Japan, our ability to defend the Philippines, our ability to have the Pacific be the lake for the US Navy, as it is today, as it has been since 1945, really disappears. It becomes very, very difficult, very, very challenging. And why does that matter? Well, because whoever controls the Pacific controls Asia from a perspective of ensuring trade routes, securing economic trade in the most vital part of the world. If you think about why we have the prosperity and the globalization that we have today, it is because the US Navy, since 1945, has protected trade routes all over the world and made it safe, easy, and cheap to transfer goods all over the world. Because the US Navy is protecting the world's oceans against aggression from nation states or pirates, as we've seen in the Red Sea and off the coast of Africa. The United States Navy makes it safe. You give that up to China, things can change very, very quickly. So what are the possible outcomes here? Well, there are three, right? The best one is China is going to be deterred from invading Taiwan. There's not going to be a war. Fantastic outcome. If we can have the equivalent of what happened in 1961, when the East Germans built the wall and Kennedy quietly celebrated, even though it was terrible, obviously, for the East Germans, for the East Berliners, but it was essential to reducing the risk of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. But if we deter China from invading Taiwan, the Cold War will remain. We still have strategic competitive interests vis-a-vis China. We still have lots of problems with China. They have lots of problems with us. But that's fine. We can compete in a way that keeps the Cold War cold without the risk of a hot conflict. There are two other scenarios, right? China invades and succeeds or fails. I would argue that both of these are going to be catastrophic for the world, for China, for Taiwan, and for the United States. Just think about, I've talked about the ramifications of China taking Taiwan without firing a shot. Now think about ramifications of the United States actually going to war with China in the Pacific. You're going to have tens of thousands of American dead, probably in a matter of weeks. The destruction of our naval forces, huge losses across our Air Force. And one of the key decisions that any president that's in power, should that ever happen, is going to have is whether to strike the mainland China and attempt to destroy the Chinese Air Force that there's on the airfields in mainland China. If that decision is not taken by him or her, the Chinese will be able to inflict tremendous losses on the US naval forces in the region. If that decision is taken and we strike those airfields with missiles and bombers, guess what? The Chinese are not going to take it. There's going to be a retaliation, right? They can probably reach the United States with their bomber forces and get the aircraft carriers close enough to American shores safely, but their missiles can. And you can bet that there's going to be retaliation against US mainland and US military bases from Chinese ballistic missiles. Now, one hopes that they will be conventional, but once you're in the missile exchange arena, where we're striking both countries, and we both have nuclear arsenals, God help us. So is it all hopeless? China is huge. Taiwan is right next to it. PLA has 2.5 million men under arms. Like, why won't they win? Well, it's not so simple. Taiwan has 23 million people, population of Taiwan. Probably around 6 million, 5 to 6 million are military age males that could be conscripted to fight for the island. PLA, as I mentioned, 2.5 million people. By the way, they can't get 2.5 million people across to Taiwan. That would be an enormous undertaking that they are not capable of. So they can probably get hundreds of thousands, but they can't get millions across. So if you actually have Taiwan train, equip, arm those people to defend the island, they can absolutely defeat an invasion. What's more, having just visited Taiwan and not just been to Taipei and visited with the leadership, but actually went to scour all the potential invasion sites on the island, I can tell you that there's probably no place on earth that is worse to invade than Taiwan. The place is literally a natural fortress. First of all, you have the Taiwan Strait that is absolute hell for navigation. Half of the year, there are typhoons and storms and really terrible weather that will prevent any amphibious invasion from taking place. Once you hit the beaches, the water is very shallow. The beaches are very rocky. They're very narrow and could be easily defended. But even if you manage to get through the beaches, you immediately hit the mountains that you have to overcome. And the way to overcome the mountains, the easiest way is to go through tunnels. Tunnels can be sabotaged. Once you get through the mountains, you hit rivers and bridges that can be blown. The terrain is literally, could be made impregnable with enough capabilities. And that is, of course, the challenge that Taiwanese face, is how to make it so in the time frame that they have. But more than that, from a deterrence perspective, the Chinese have a great dependency on Taiwan for chips, as well as the broader West, economic dependency that, of course, goes beyond the chips. So they have to think about the ramifications, not just of conflict with Taiwan and attempting to take this natural fortress of an island, but also the prospect of going to war with the United States and potentially our allies, but also the impact on their economy as a result of that invasion. And they've seen, of course, what we've done to Russia from an economic sanctions and export controls perspective, and they have to fear what we could do to them in response to that invasion, even if we choose not to fight. And lastly, China has not fought a war since 1979. And you want to remember who they fought a war with in 1979? It's a country called Vietnam. And they got their behind handed to them in that war. It went terribly for them, just like it did for us. The Vietnamese are ferocious fighters. There is no one that's an active general in the Chinese military that has seen combat. There's one older gentleman that is on the Politburo that has seen that war, but he's not operational military planner. So they face a huge challenge. This would be probably the most difficult military invasion in history to accomplish, getting so many forces across the strait and landing in Taiwan and trying to take this island that could be very well defended. Very, very difficult for them to accomplish. And that is no doubt one of the reasons why they haven't yet done this. Those difficulties they're very well aware of. And lastly, they're not just facing the United States. They're seeing what is happening now in the region, in part because of the threat that they've increasingly been posing to Taiwan and the broader region. They've seen AUKUS, the alliance between the United Kingdom and Australia and the United States, that both brings advanced submarines, nuclear submarines, to Australia and allows us to base nuclear submarines in Perth, Australia, much closer to the region, but also provides other advanced capabilities, including the area of hypersonics and quantum computing and others that these countries are focusing on advancing. You have the Quad that includes Japan and India, along with Australia and the United States, where it's not an alliance, and India probably will never join an alliance, but nevertheless, there is more military planning, more military integration, more military exercises, and economic dependence that's being developed there. They've seen Japan investing significantly in their military capabilities in recent years and continue to do so. And the Philippines, reverse policy, decades policy, when they kicked out America in the early 90s. We left. We did not have any bases on the Philippines. For the first time in decades, we're back. The U.S. military is back and now has bases right near Taiwan. So I will leave you with this. About 150 years before Christ, in the Roman Empire, you had the Roman senator, Cato the Elder, and every single speech that he would give in the Roman Senate with the phrase, delenda est Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed. The phrase I will leave you with is sine deterrenda sunt. China must be deterred. We have to do whatever it takes to avoid a catastrophic war over this regional flashpoint of Taiwan that is essential both to them and us, and most importantly, of course, to the Taiwanese people. And if we manage to do that over the next decade of Xi Jinping's rule, and we come out on the other side in the 1930s with Taiwan conflict avoided, this century will remain an American century. Because the other thing that's playing here is a trajectory of the Chinese population and of their economy. They're facing a demographic collapse that has been triggered by the one China policy that they implemented in the 70s, that has been accelerated by the middle income trap, fertility trap that every developed country falls into, which is that the birth rates have plummeted. And now, since 2019 at least, and probably earlier, they've seen the population dramatically decline and aging, which will have devastating effects on their ability to grow. But beyond that, they've reached the middle income trap, where any country that has reached in modern times 10,000 per capita GDP, $10,000 per capita, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea or others, has basically faced much lower growth. In the case of Japan, stagnation. And many economists believe that's what China is facing now. So their prospects of catching up to the United States in terms of economic power, if they don't take Taiwan and dominate the Pacific, are much, much less. And their ability to grow both the economy and invest in their military as a result will diminish significantly in the 1930s and beyond. So with that, I will leave you with one last thought, which is that I've talked to you a lot about the problem and why it is essential to deter China from invading Taiwan. But the plan for actually deterring them is in the book. So I hope you check it out. There's a QR code to order it. And the book is essentially the game plan for how do we avoid this conflict? How do we get back from the brink and maintain peace and prosperity for the rest of the century? Thank you very much.